It's easy to forget about the planet's basic recycling work, like
Yeah.
uh, turning our CO2 back into air. Nature does it for free.
It really does. But the thing is, as our sources point out, we're now emitting more than nature can handle. It's a bit like overfishing, isn't it? Depleting the stock.
Yeah, exactly. It definitely makes you rethink our whole footprint.
It does. And well, that's really what this deep dive is focused on. We've pulled together quite a mix of materials, scientific papers, assessment tools, examples from history, modern architecture, all sorts.
Mm-hmm.
And our goal today really is to explore how we can weave nature's own strategies, ecological principles, right into how we design and build.
Right. So think of this, for you listening, as a direct path to understanding eco-architecture. We're aiming to skip the super technical jargon.
Yeah, definitely.
We want to pull out those core ideas, those aha moments that show how buildings can maybe do more than just less harm, how they can actually boost sustainability, resilience, maybe even our own well-being.
That's the plan.
So our mission is pretty clear. Let's unpack this stuff and really get a handle on the principles and the practical ways of designing with nature, not against it.
Okay, let's dive in. So that basic idea, designing with nature, it's a big shift, right? Moving away from thinking of buildings as these like isolated boxes.
Totally separate from everything.
Exactly. Instead, you start seeing them as connected, part of a bigger ecological web. The sources really contrast this with, well, the more conventional way that often just sees the environment as something outside, maybe even something to conquer.
And one tool that jumped out from the materials is this green footstep calculator. It's described as an ecological assessment tool, which sounds different from systems just comparing a building to code. What's the key difference there?
Well, the big thing the Green Footstep tool brings in is this concept of carrying capacity for the built environment.
Carrying capacity.
Yeah. So it's not just looking at, say, how much more efficient a building is compared to a baseline. It actually considers the absolute ecological limits of the site itself and the area around it.
So it's not just relative improvement.
Precisely. And that's crucial because, being less bad than a standard building doesn't necessarily mean you're actually operating sustainably within what the environment can support. It forces you to think about the actual ecological work a site can sort of handle.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about striving for a real balance with Earth systems, not just chipping away at the negative impacts. The sources also get into the carbon neutral building approach. Could you break down the main strategies there?
Sure. So getting a building to carbon neutral usually involves, well, two main things. First, you really prioritize generating as much renewable energy on site as possible.
Okay.
So that means integrating things like solar PV panels, maybe small wind turbines, solar hot water systems, geothermal, using the site's resources.
So the building itself becomes a kind of mini power plant, tapping into what's naturally available.
Very much, yeah.
And the second part involves off-site carbon investments. How does that fit in?
Right. The second strategy is about investing in projects elsewhere that actively pull carbon out of the atmosphere or prevent emissions.
Like planting trees or funding renewable energy somewhere else.
Exactly. Things like reforestation or helping build large-scale solar or wind farms. And interestingly, that green footstep calculator we mentioned, it actually balances the building's energy use against its on-site renewable production to figure out its net carbon footprint. It even lets you specify what kind of backup fuel you might use, say for heating, to get a more accurate picture of what needs offsetting.
Okay, that gives us a good starting point. Now, what's really fascinating is how these modern ideas echo some really old wisdom. Our sources look at Javanese design, for instance, where buildings and nature are seen as, well, almost seamlessly connected, like one entity.
Yeah, it's quite profound. The emphasis there is on creating what they call ambiguous boundaries, spaces that are sort of designed for constant interplay with nature, adapting to the seasons, the weather.
Ambiguous boundaries.
Yeah.
I like that.
And Kabori Enshi's Boson Tea Room is a fantastic example. It has this hanging paper screen. It's not just a blind, it acts as an entrance, it frames the view, it controls privacy, it diffuses light.
Wow, one element doing all that.
Exactly. It really captures that idea of living lightly, designing for flexibility, constantly adjusting the connection between inside and outside.
Like a breathing membrane almost. I can totally see how that idea, adaptable multitasking elements could be so useful in, say, dense cities today where you don't always have a great view. These kinds of screens could still let you connect with light and air in a really subtle way.
Absolutely. And looking beyond Japan, the sources also touch on Vastu Shastra, the ancient Indian architectural tradition.
Right.
Now, this system considers a whole range of environmental factors, sun
Mhm.
paths, magnetic fields, even, more subtle energy flows, all relating back to the human body and the cosmos.
It's interesting, isn't it, how these ancient principles, even if we might interpret the why differently now with science, often show this deep intuitive grasp of how nature affects us and our spaces.
It really does.
Makes you wonder if we've maybe lost some of that connection with our more tech-heavy approaches.
That's a really good point. While, the specific mechanisms in Vastu Shastra might be debated today, the core principle of designing in response to nature, thinking about sun, wind, local materials, that absolutely aligns with modern eco-architecture goals.
So there's a long history there.
Definitely. A long history of cultures trying to tune their buildings to the environment.
And speaking of culture, the sources really stress how culture shapes traditional homes. It's not just about what one person likes, is it?
Not at all. It's about how a whole culture shaped by its climate, its history, its social rules, figures out how to build and live. And what's striking is that you can find similar building layouts in totally different cultures if they face similar climates.
Really?
Yeah, it suggests that the actual activities people do in their homes and those basic environmental needs often matter more than just surface style.
So function and climate really drive form in those cases.
Exactly. Which leads us to sort of the common ground in vernacular architecture, those traditional local building styles.
Mm.
They almost inherently respond to where they are. They tend to use local materials, which often work best for the local microclimate, providing natural insulation or thermal mass.
Right, makes sense.
And the shapes, the structures themselves, are usually well suited to the weather, strong roofs for snow, or good ventilation for heat. As the sources say, climate has this huge influence on life and culture, and that blends with beliefs to shape how people build.
So traditional building isn't just quaint, it's this massive library of tested strategies for working with nature.
Okay, let's pivot now to some modern eco-innovations. The Seed Pod project comes up as a really interesting contemporary example.
Yeah, the seed pod is fascinating.
Hmm.
The key idea there is its outer shell acting as a selective filter. It's not just a dumb wall. It's designed to actively interact with sun, wind, temperature.
A selective filter. How so?
Well, for instance, it has this optimally sloped south-facing solar array, but it's also bifacial, meaning it collects light from both sides.
Exactly. Gets direct sunlight, but also captures light reflected off the ground underneath it. That really boosts its efficiency, using light that would otherwise just be lost.
That's clever, very resourceful. And it also has an evacuated cylinder hot water system. Sounds efficient.
Extremely efficient for heating water. But it's not just about active energy generation.
Mhm.
The seed pod also uses passive techniques like stack effect ventilation.
The chimney effect, basically.
Pretty much. Cooler, denser air comes in low down, gets warmed inside, becomes lighter, and naturally rises out through high openings, like windows in the clerestory.
Reducing the need for fans and AC.
Right. Though it does have ductless heat pumps and AC units for when active conditioning is needed.
Okay. And then there's that water wall inside. The sources mentioned its aesthetic qualities, how it plays with daylight, creates patterns,
Mm-hmm. It sounds quite beautiful.
but it's also functional, right? As thermal mass. Can you explain that?
Sure. Water is actually really good at storing heat, much better than, say, concrete or brick per unit volume. So during the day, the water wall absorbs excess heat from inside, helping keep things cool.
Okay.
Then at night, when it gets cooler outside, the water slowly releases that stored heat back into the space, moderating the temperature swings.
Like a thermal battery.
Essentially, yes. And you can even control the water temperature somewhat. Plus, there's an air gap, an air plenum, between the outer shell and the water wall. Incoming ventilation air passes through this gap, so it can be pre-warmed or pre-cooled by the water wall before it even enters the main space.
Very integrated. And the glazing sounds really high-tech, with meiosis and mydriasis functions, like an eye.
Sort of, yeah. It uses smart materials that physically expand or contract with temperature changes. This movement adjusts elements within the glazing assembly to let more or less light through, dynamically responding to the sun's intensity.
So the building itself is actively adjusting to the light conditions. Amazing.
Exactly. And this kind of thinking ties into the idea of digital green architecture.
Okay, what's meant by that term?
It's not just about tacking solar panels onto a standard design or using digital tools to make cool, freeform shapes. It's about using digital technology right from the start to fundamentally rethink the design process with sustainability baked in.
So it's deeper than just getting a green rating or making
Yeah.
something look futuristic.
Much deeper. It's about a true synergy. Digital tools let architects simulate and analyze environmental factors in incredible detail.
Like what?
Like, you can model how sun packs and wind flow will affect a building, and then literally shape the building's form to optimize passive heating, cooling, natural light, ventilation.
So the environment actually dictates the form, in a way.
In a very direct way, yes.
Yeah.
And digital design also makes it easier to work with advanced sustainable materials, things like glass fiber, reinforced concrete, which uses less material, or recyclable steels, carbon fiber, special reflective coatings, enabling really efficient and innovative structures.
It's like the digital world gives us this powerful lens to fine-tune how buildings interact with nature. Okay, let's zoom out a bit now and think about the wider impacts. The sources mention Socio-Environmental Impact Assessment, SIA. Why is that so important?
Well, connecting this to the bigger picture, eco-architecture isn't ultimately just about single buildings in isolation. It's about building sustainable communities.
Right.
And SIA recognizes that society, the economy, and the environment are all deeply linked. It's a way to systematically look at the potential effects, good and bad, intended and unintended, of a building project on people and the planet.
Trying to make sure development benefits everyone involved sustainably.
Exactly. And there's a really telling case study in the materials about affordable housing in the Arab Gulf. It highlights this tension between environmental design and really important cultural needs.
Like privacy and separating spaces for guests and family.
Precisely. And what's fascinating is how traditional housing in that region actually handled both the climate and these cultural requirements really well for centuries.
Ah, but modern designs often miss that.
Often, yes. Designs developed without that deep cultural understanding can fail to meet those needs. And the consequences aren't trivial. People might be unhappy. They might use way more energy for AC trying to compensate for bad design.
And cultural traditions themselves might even start to fade if the living spaces don't support them.
It can happen. It really drives home that true sustainability has to be culturally sensitive too, not just green in a technical sense.
Definitely. The sources also show some inspiring urban nature projects, like the Water Garden in Portland or the Living Water Park in Chengdu. They're presented as successful urban wetlands. What do these kinds of projects achieve?
Oh, they offer huge benefits. These urban wetlands show how you can blend city planning with wetland ecology. They help manage stormwater naturally, filtering it and letting it soak in.
Reducing runoff and pollution.
Right. They also boost biodiversity right in the city, create lovely green spaces for people, help clean the air, and can even significantly reduce urban flooding risks. They turn urban challenges into ecological opportunities.
That's fantastic. Then there's the idea of floating houses. The sources mention them as a potential answer to housing shortages and rising sea levels, maybe even using water surfaces for renewables. But are there big challenges?
That's a really interesting area. Floating houses offer exciting possibilities, absolutely. But yeah, there are definitely hurdles.
Like what?
Well, you've got material durability things constantly in water corrode. How do you reliably get power and water to them and get waste away without polluting? And of course, safety and stability are huge concerns, especially in moving water. Lots to figure out there.
So promising, but complex. Shifting slightly, there's this concept of educational ecological architecture, with primary school in rural Bangladesh as an example. It sounds like a very holistic project using local materials and methods.
It really does. What's amazing about that school is how deeply it involved the community, local builders, students, parents, teachers, all working with readily available materials like earth, straw, bamboo.
Using traditional techniques in new ways.
Exactly. It shows how sustainable building can also empower people, celebrate local knowledge and resources, and even be a teaching tool itself. The building becomes a lesson in sustainable living.
The building as curriculum. That's powerful. And finally, in this section, the trabocchi on the Italian coast, these old fishing platforms, they're presented as sustainable heritage. How so?
The trabocchi are these amazing examples of how traditional ways of building and living can be tied directly to sustainable resource use and a real understanding of the local coast.
They fished from them, right?
Right. They represent a way of getting sustenance from the sea while respecting the coastal ecology. The sources suggest they're almost like a manifesto for future coastal development, showing the value of traditional ecological knowledge and ecocultural activities that work with the environment.
So many diverse examples. Okay, let's really drill down into a core element of green building.
Yeah.
Energy efficiency. Reducing energy demand is priority one, right?
Absolutely, that's the main goal. And passive solar design is key here.
Which means
Things like orienting the building smartly to catch winter sun but block summer sun, using natural breezes for cooling, designing for cross ventilation, and using materials with high thermal mass.
thermal mass like thick walls.
Yeah, materials like stone, concrete, brick, even water that absorb heat slowly and release it slowly helps keep temperatures stable day and night.
And old Dubai's traditional architecture is given as a great example for hot climates.
It really is. They used courtyards to create cooler, shaded areas, wind towers to funnel breezes down into the buildings, lots of shading, thick walls for that thermal mass, insulation, even plants to help cool things down. Just brilliant passive strategies.
So clever.
And the sources break down passive strategies specifically for the building's skin, the walls, and roof. Things like window orientation, overhangs, louvers for shading, good insulation.
Including green roofs and green walls.
Yes. Green walls and roofs are fantastic. They reduce heat gain through evaporation, they lower the actual surface temperature, they add insulation value, and they help fight the urban heat island effect. Plus, high-performance windows make a big difference.
And getting air moving naturally is crucial for cooling, too.
Definitely. Natural ventilation, cross-ventilation, getting that heat out. And traditional elements like those wind towers or courtyards designed to encourage airflow were masters at enhancing that. It's amazing what you can achieve just by working with the climate, not fighting it.
It really is. Now let's talk about something maybe less tangible, but still vital. Light and aesthetics. The sources mention the history and cultural weight of, like, subtle light variations.
Yeah, it's quite thought-provoking. Historically, many cultures really paid attention to the quality of natural light at different times of day or year, sometimes linking it to ceremonies or spiritual moments.
And the suggestion is maybe our constant artificial light has kind of dulled our senses to those subtleties.
It's possible, yeah. And what's really compelling is the idea that by carefully tuning light in a space, how it enters, how it reflects, the color temperature, you can dramatically enrich the whole architectural experience.
This is not just about being able to see properly.
No, it affects our comfort, our mood, our mental well-being. The sources even connected to things like Epicurean ataraxia, that state of calm, or Zen not thinking, both involving a kind of relaxation of the senses.
Interesting connection. And the Rowashan, those projecting wooden screens in traditional Makkah architecture, are highlighted as a way of artfully managing light.
Beautifully so. Roshan did provide shade and ventilation, yes, but they were also designed to filter that intense desert sun, cutting the glare and casting these intricate, shifting patterns of light and shadow inside.
So they shape the light quality.
Exactly. The louvres and the lattice grids, the shish, worked together to create an interior that was comfortable but also visually rich, a real mastery of light.
It really shows that aesthetics in eco-architecture isn't just superficial looks. It's about the whole sensory experience of being in a space. Okay, shifting now to life cycle thinking and material choices. The sources bring up things like emergy evaluation. What on earth is emergy?
Yeah, emergy. It's an interesting concept from thermodynamics, actually. It's a way to try and quantify all the energy, direct and indirect, that goes into making something, a resource, a product, whatever.
So not just the energy used in the factory, but everything.
Everything. Tracing it all back to original environmental energy sources, like sunlight. Unlike just looking at the economic costs, Emergy tries to give you a broader system-level view of the real environmental work or resources embodied in something.
There's like an ecological footprint measured in energy units.
Kind of,
Yeah.
yeah. It helps calculate sustainability indicators and understand the true resource cost beyond just dollars and cents. It reveals hidden dependencies and impacts.
Okay, a more holistic environmental accounting. And the sources also hammer home the importance of doing a full life cycle assessment, LCA, for building materials, including demolition waste.
Absolutely critical. You have to look at the whole lifespan.
Yeah.
Choosing low-impact materials, designing for reuse, planning for recycling at the end, that all drastically cuts the environmental burden.
From cradle to grave,
Yeah.
or cradle to cradle, ideally.
Exactly. And LCA looks at everything. Extracting raw materials, manufacturing, transport, construction, the building's use phase, and then what happens at the end, demolition, disposal, recycling. The sources even give an LCA example for solar panels, comparing the energy needed to make them versus the clean energy they produce over decades.
And the emissions they avoid compared to fossil fuels.
Precisely. It shows the net benefit, but you have to do the full calculation.
It's so crucial to take that long view. As the sources point out, even materials we think of as renewable, like wood, need their whole life cycle. Examined forestry practices, transport, processing, treatments.
Right. It's not always simple, which is why tools like Materio are being developed.
Ontario.
Yeah, it's an example of a tool designed to give architects and designers info about the environmental impacts of materials early in the design process when choices really matter.
What kind of info?
It goes beyond just energy or carbon, looking at things like human health impacts, water use, the whole material life cycle, trying to empower designers to make genuinely better choices right from the start.
Tools like that seem essential if we're going to make real progress. Okay, let's look towards the future now and adaptability. Fractal geometry comes up. How does that relate to architecture?
It's a really interesting idea. Fractals, have that self-similarity patterns repeating at different scales and a kind of natural hierarchy.
Like a fern or a coastline?
Exactly.
Right.
The thinking is that using fractal principles in design could lead to spatial organizations that are inherently more adaptable, more able to grow or change organically over time, fitting more harmoniously with nature's own patterns. Buildings that can evolve, maybe?
Buildings that can evolve. Fascinating. But the sources also inject a note of caution about relying too much on computer simulations and performance scores. What's the concern there?
Well, those tools are powerful, no doubt, but their output is only as good as the input data, which can sometimes be iffy or incomplete.
Garbage in, garbage out.
Pretty much.
Hmm.
And there's a risk that focusing too heavily on hitting quantifiable targets might sideline important qualitative aspects, how a space feels, intuitive design wisdom, user experience, things that are harder to measure but still vital for true sustainability.
And the Seattle City Hall example is mentioned.
Yeah.
LED certified but didn't perform so well in reality.
Right. It's a reminder that simulation isn't reality. We need a balance, use the tools, but also apply sound design principles, common sense, and actually monitor how buildings perform once they're built.
That makes sense. And maintainability is highlighted as being key for long-term sustainability, often overlooked, maybe.
Very often, I think. But designing for maintainability, making things easy to inspect, clean, repair, replace components is crucial for maximizing a building's useful life.
It's about slowing that journey from resource to waste.
Exactly. Viewing maintenance not as a chore, but as a strategic way to keep the building performing well and extend its lifespan, reducing the need for major resource-intensive interventions later on.
Thinking long-term from day one. There's also this interesting framing of natural and built places as linked equipments for human dwelling. What does that mean?
It's a perspective that tries to break down the sharp divide we often make between nature and the built environment.
Seeing them as separate things.
Right. Instead, it suggests viewing them as existing on a continuum. Both are kinds of equipment that enable us to live. They're interconnected components supporting human life. And the idea is that maybe IT, information tech, could help strengthen those links, making our built spaces more responsive to and integrated with the natural world around them.
Interesting concept. And finally, looking ahead, the sources point to examples like EnviroHome or BedZED, communities really trying to put it all together.
Yeah, these are real-world examples showing holistic planning, energy efficiency, sustainable materials, water management, community aspects, all integrated. And they also touch on exciting new tech coming along, like aerogel insulation,
Which is super insulating.
incredibly insulating for its thickness, and advanced thin film solar cells that are more flexible, opening up new ways to integrate solar power into building surfaces.
So innovation is definitely continuing.
Absolutely. These examples show the principles are being put into practice, and new tools and materials are constantly emerging to help us build better.
So really, after digging into all this, it feels like that phrase from one source sums it up. Eco-architecture or sustainable building means to build intelligently.
I think that's spot on. It's not about one single trick. It's about a comprehensive approach, thinking smartly about the environment, the people using the building, society, economics, all of it together.
Moving beyond just doing less harm towards actively creating buildings and places that, work better with nature and actually improve our quality of life.
That's the goal, definitely.
Okay, so wrapping up, some key takeaways for you, the listener. We've seen that crucial shift from buildings as isolated objects to parts of ecological and cultural systems. We've touched on ancient wisdom alongside cutting-edge, nature-inspired tech. And we've seen how vital it is to think about the whole life cycle and design for the long haul, including maintenance.
Right. And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Having heard about all these different approaches, from Japanese tea rooms to digital design, what single principle of eco-architecture really resonates with you personally? And how might that start to shape how you think about the spaces we all live and work in?
That's a great question to ponder. We definitely encourage you to explore these ideas further, maybe look up some of the projects or concepts we mentioned. This deep dive, it's really just scratching the surface of a huge and fascinating field.